The OPM alternative music has been in and out of the mainstream for the past few decades. Well, in the first place, kaya nga siya tinawag na alternative kasi hindi siya yung popular choice at the time. Pero there are a lot of moments in time na talaga namang namayagpag sa mga airwaves ang OPM alternative music. Paano nga ba to nangyari? At saan na nga ba papunta ang OPM alternative music? Let's go back in time at pag-usapan natin ang quick history at kung saan nga ba papunta ang OPM alternative music. Hello YouTube! Welcome to geekylabsph. Sa channel na to, pag-uusapan natin ang OPM alternative scene and pop culture in general. Kaya naman, if you like these types of videos, please make sure to like and subscribe para naman updated ka every time na mag-upload ako ng bagong content. Maaga akong naamulat sa Pinoy alternative music dahil ito yung trip ng mga tito at tita ko nung bata pa ako. I remember when one of my titos bought a cassette tape of ultra-electromagnetic pop at dito ko unang narinig yung version ng pare ko na merong diba, tangina. At a very young age, I was super amazed kasi sa bahay at sa kalye ko lang naririnig yung mga ganong mura. Pwede din pala siyang ilagay sa kanta at i-record. Since then, inaabangan ko na palagi kung kailan magsa-soundtrip yung mga tito at tita ko. And then one time, I remember masyado akong na-carried away habang sinasabayan ko yung kantang pare ko at alam niyo na siguro kung ano nangyari. I was around 6 years old at the time and napatulala ako at napatigil habang yung tito ko naman tawa ng tawa. During Sundays, doon ko naman napapakinggan yung mga classics habang nakikinig sina lolo at lola sa mga AM radio stations in between the morning news. Before I begin, quick disclaimer, gusto ko lang iklaro na base to sa research at personal experience ko. Kaya naman kung mayroong mga banda or artist ako na hindi mababanggit sa mga eras na dadaanan natin sa video na to, please don't be mad, pero don't hesitate to put that in the comments para naman mapag-usapan natin yan. Para sa akin, the best decade to start this conversation is during the 60s. Obviously, hindi pa ako pinapanganak nung era na to. Pero again, madalas ko siyang mapakinggan tuwing linggo ng umaga. This era was dominated by Western-influenced pop jazz ballads and country songs at nakikipagsabayan din yung ating modern version of kundiman.
Sa buhay ko dahil sa'yo.
Meanwhile, on the alternative side of things, during the mid-60s, a new kind of music started to emerge, headed by Ramon Jacinto's The Riots, and Jose Mari's The Electromaniacs. They popularized the instrumental rock and roll and blues. However, with the emergence of the so-called British invasion to the Philippines, nagsimulang magsulputan yung mga banda at artists na influence ng British rock and roll. Bands like the Dinosaurs, and Tilt Down Men featuring Tito Sotto on vocals. During this time, Pinoy rock didn't get much attention until the end of this decade. But something changed during the following decade, the 70s. In the early 70s, Pinoy pop still dominated the airwaves with the emergence of folk pop like Freddie Aguilar and Florante, and disco funk bands like VST and Company, Rico J. Puno, and of course, the very legendary Hot Dog. Na talaga namang malaki naging impact sa OPM dahil nung panahon na yon ay mas patok na patok sa masa ang mga music na galing sa ibang bansa. Isa ang Hot Dog sa bumuhay sa OPM scene and this was dubbed as the Manila Sound. The OPM alternative scene started to emerge with bands like Anak Bayan and Juan de la Cruz Band, with their blues and rock and roll influence, but compared to their Western counterparts, they sounded less poppy. They started the golden age of Pinoy rock as they managed to enter the mainstream together with other artists like Sampaguita, Asin, and Maria Cafra.
Kumusta mga kaibigan?
In this era, the OPM alternative scene was going head-to-head with pop scene as artists like Juan de la Cruz Band and Sampaguita were headlining music events and festivals. It was fun times, which brings me to the next decade, the 80s. In the 80s, the Manila sound and OPM pop continued to dominate the airwaves, pero yung Pinoy alternative scene also started to flourish. During this time, nagsimula na yung mga movement ng mga Pinoy folk bands like Noel Cabangon and Buklod.
Habang may tatsulog at sila ang nasa tuktok, hindi matatapos.
Together with Inang Bayan.
Teacher, genius ka kaya, bukod sa lesson plan may thesis pa.
They were doing campus tours and street concerts to promote their social and political message. During this time, nagsimula ring magsulputan yung mga Pinoy punk bands tulad ng The Jerks,
Kapwa Pilipino, kinahihiya mo.
Betrayed, and Woods.
Yung nagtataka. Kayong nagtataka.
But for me, the highlight of the OPM alternative scene in this era was catapulted by one of the most influential OPM band, The Dawn.
Singing Lama and below Tatian doesn't see us.
I was not even born yet during their high times and was still too young to understand their impact to the music scene at the time, but the Dawn together with Identity Crisis and After Image, they shaped the landscape for the OPM alternative scene to blow up in the mainstream at nangyari na nga to sa sumunod na dekada, the 90s. We now have come to the decade that most of us are very familiar to. Sa simula ng dekada, bands like Intro Voice and After Image carried the momentum that the Dawn and Identity Crisis started until the second wave of the band explosion in the OPM scene started to blow up. Bands like Eraserheads, River Maya, The Teeth, Parokya ni Edgar, Yano, Green Department made their way into the mainstream. Towards the mid to late 90s, Club Dread and Mayrix were the place to be if you want to watch these bands live, together with hundreds of other up-and-coming bands and musicians. It was the second golden age of the OPM alternative scene. And that brings us to the next decade, the 2000s.
God exists 360 degrees like a soul mysteries. You
The second half of this decade was considered as the third wave of the OPM alternative music's golden age. At the tail end of the 90s, the OPM pop scene continued to go head-to-head with the alternative music scene until the emergence of the Western boy bands. R&B and hip-hop also started to take over the airwaves. The OPM alternative scene took a turn in the early 2000s as heavier bands started to take over. Bands like Slapshot, Greyhounds,
What's up as a B.I.G. What's up as a B.I.G.
Queso, who was known as Cheese at the time, and of course, CHICOSCI. From pop rock, post-punk, and new wave of the second half of the 80s to the latter part of the 90s, the scene shifted to heavier sounding and nu metal sound, which was popular at the time. This era spawned tons of other bands in the underground like Zoom, Power Spoons, and the hardcore and punk scene moved to underground scene in Laguna with the most famous acts like Piledriver, Unheard, and Typecast. By the mid-2000s, bands like Sponge Cola, Sandwich, Moonstar 88, Kitchen Nadal, Barbie Almalbis, and of course, products of Music Laban like Mayonnaise and Join the Club essentially picked up where the bands from the 90s left off.
Matatanggap ako
Meanwhile, on the not-so-mainstream side of the OPM alternative scene, we got urban dub, fast pitch, and Sheila and the Insects from Cebu. We also got progressive metal bands like Eternal Now and Fusebox, who were surprisingly knocking at the mainstream's door at the time. We got heavier bands like Sadie, Valley of Chrome, and Sky Church that were blowing up in the underground at the time. Music festivals like NU107's Summer Shebang, pocket concerts, and their campus tours really helped the OPM alternative scene alive. I remember for just 50 to 100 pesos at the time, makakanood ka na ng live concerts with jam-packed lineup at may libre ka pang isang cup ng beer. They also had the annual Rock Awards, which totally helped the scene stay relevant. There are a lot of festivals and events that are solely dedicated to the OPM alternative scene at the time, tulad ng annual Pop Summer Slam, Tanduay Rock Fest, at marami pang iba. Every weekend, halos hindi mo alam kung saan ka pupunta. It was a great time to be alive. By the tail end of the 2000s decade, madami pang mga bandang pinalad na makasama sa third wave of band explosion hype at nakapasok sa mainstream. However, most of these bands were leaning towards pop sound, and by the 2010s, in my opinion, this is the start of another decline. November 2010, nang magpaalam sa ere ang NU107, which to me really affected the OPM alternative scene big time. Aside from their annual rock awards and their multitude of rock events, napakalaking tulong ng radio station na to para sa mga up-and-coming artists na magkaroon ng platform to share their music. I was talking specifically about their show In The Raw. Para sa mga hindi na to inabutan, this show featured a lot of artists like Urban Dub, Typecast, Sadie, at marami pang iba who were able to make it big time in the mainstream. Bands like Tanya Markova and Up Dharma Down maintained the moderate success in the mainstream and paved the way for other artists like Autotelic, Grace Note, and even to have their one foot at the mainstream's door. The influence of the OPM alternative scene in the 90s and mid to late 2000s inspired a lot of new artists. Kaya naman in 2010, there are a lot of bands like Four of Spades, Ben and Ben, and December Avenue na nakapasok agad sa mainstream. Although these bands were obviously in the pop side of the band scene, hindi natin makakaila na they were products of the alternative music scene of the previous decades. This leads me to the present time, the current decade, 2020s. I'm a person who loves discovering new artists from all types of genres, especially kung bago sa pandinig ko yung sound nila. Artists like Space Moses and Gaba, release new materials, and bands like Amateurish, Rin, and Lilith. We're also gaining momentum in the underground scene. But to me, mga legacy artists pa din ang bumubuhat sa OPM alternative scene until today. It's not a bad thing, pero para sa akin, hindi ba mas maganda kung mga new generation naman ang mga mag-headline ng mga music festivals tulad ng 123 Pikit, Rin, and Amateurish? The recently concluded Rakrakan Festival featured a lot of relatively new artists. Pero kung mapapansin nyo, the headlines were mostly legacy bands, which is again, hindi naman masama. Pero tulad ng nangyari sa mga events ng NU107, wala na tayong aabangang Rakrakan Festival sa mga susunod na taon. OPM alternative scene is still very much alive, pero dahil nga wala ng radio station tulad ng NU107 na dedicated solely sa Pinoy alternative scene at nabawasan na din yung mga musical events to promote these artists, we are experiencing another decline. Para sa akin, for the OPM alternative scene to blow up again, tulad ng mga nagdaang dekada, we need to support the underground scene more than ever. Let's be more open to new bands and stop gatekeeping. If we really want the OPM alternative scene to flourish and succeed, tigilan na natin yung mindset na cool tayo tapos sila cringy. Kung ayaw natin ma-stuck sa mga hugot bands like what is really popular today, we need to be more supportive of new artists. We can support new artists by sharing the links to their music, showing up to their shows, buying their merch, and most importantly, kung wala tayong magandang sasabihin about them, we can just keep our mouths shut. I am all for constructive criticisms and helpful feedback, pero kung ang intention mo lang ay mang-bash, make sure muna that you have the talent to back it up. Alright, that's it for me today, and thank you very much for watching. Again, if you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. This will help my channel a lot. I will see you again next time.